weathered the storm under pressure, then decided to form an orchestra. But the tongue boy said, we must try again. We do agree to comport and speak.
Hi, I'm Shanice Jessup, and this is my presentation on sponsorship in Pan. That song that you just heard is called The Toco Band by Lord Kitchener, and I will explain its relevance later on in the presentation. But let's begin. So I would encourage you to pause the video here and see if you can name the bands that these companies sponsor. So feel free to pause the video and see if you got the right answers. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that activity, and I'm about to start the presentation now by first explaining what is the role of a sponsor. So according to mypanyard.co.uk, a sponsor is any individual or group that provides the support to or for an event, activity, person, or organization, either financially or through the provision of products and or services. The individual or group who provides sponsorship usually benefits by brand recognition. The beginning of sponsorship in Trinidad and Tobago started off with government support, but not for the reasons one might think. And here I'm quoting mostly from Shannon Dudley's book, Music from Behind the Bridge. Dudley says that sponsorship in Pan originated from one political party's attempt to solidify a national Creole culture. Around the legislative election of 1956, the political party, the People's National Movement, were relying on Steelpan leaders in Navantil to garner votes for them and also to intimidate supporters and members of the Democratic Labour Party. In return, Steelpans received preferential access to community and youth development programs, government work programs, and other benefits. The PNM originally saw Steelpans as gangs rather than as musical organizations. Though they supported the bands, they did not necessarily identify with the culture. It wasn't until the Black Power movement in 1970 that the PNM was pressured to take a more Afrocentric cultural stance. Prime Minister Dr. Eric Williams began making highly publicized visits to Panyards, known as a Meet the Panmen tour. He spoke with new enthusiasm about the cultural value of Pan. Sponsorship then became a collaboration between public and private entities. The PNM government gave out political favors and prize money, but also helped to encourage private sponsorship of steel vans. Calls for sponsorship were directed especially at multinational corporations who needed to gain favor with the new government. Some of the first private businesses to sponsor steel bands were Esso, Shell, BWIA, and TNTech Power Commissions. Still, sponsorship did not truly blossom until after the very successful 1951 European tour of the Trinidad All-Steel Percussion Orchestra, also known as TASPO. By 1966, out of the 19 steel bands registered with NATTS, 26 had private sponsors. By 1968, the only unsponsored band to make the Panorama Finals was All Stars, which acquired a sponsor, the Catelli Company, the following year. Pressure from the PNM became unnecessary once businesses saw the opportunity to associate their names with a popular spectacle. Sponsoring companies had their branding featured on the banners and pan racks of steel bands at Panorama. In 1969, steel band sponsors even banded together during Panorama season to found a steel band supplement magazine in the Trinidad Guardian. This featured historical articles on individual steel bands, the sponsors' role in helping them, and lots of business advertisements. So on this slide we have two figures. One is a scan from a newspaper clipping from the Daily Express. This was when Dr. Eric Williams went to Tobago to liaise with steel bands about getting sponsors, and one of the sponsors that he was able to get for one of the bands was the Esso sponsor, which was one of the first sponsors in Steelpan. Also, in the next image on your right, we see the figures of government funding for Panorama, and you can see in 1963 it started off with just $1,000, which might have still been a lot back then, but by 2006 the money had raised to $400,000. So every year, the government was putting more and more money into Panorama and other pan shows. So for the purpose of my research, I'm focusing more on the impact of sponsorship on pan. And for this presentation, I will list some of the points I've gathered. I'll start off with the more negative impacts first, and then I'll gradually move on to the more positive impacts. So one of the first impacts I want to talk about is a loss of identity. And this is coming from Kumar Singh, quoting Brownson, who writes that the true visage of the Steelpan movement has been altered due to institutional recognition and sponsorship. The constant battles between bands are gone. The players have no personal stake in the process. The band is no longer ours, but Amoko's. And in this quote, he was talking about Renegades because Amoko's was one of their first sponsors. The dynamic has changed as bands are now judged on the stage of the savannah, not by each other, but by chosen officials. Therefore, here we see that commercial sponsorship was to some a dubious advantage, involving control over the bands and less independence than the bands had previously enjoyed. Another impact of sponsorship is the creation of wealth inequalities. So sponsorship has created inequities among bands and within bands. Whereas in the early days, bands relied on self-sufficiency and sourcing labor within the community, sponsors encouraged steel bands to hire professionals from outside the community and even the country. Wealthy bands' ability to hire the best arrangers, buy the best instruments, and limit dependency on the skills of their own members has resulted in advantages in competitions. Bands who do well in pan competitions receive more money from sponsors and attract top players. Kumar Singh warned that unless steel orchestras receive some kind of special government attention, like funding or assistance or corporate sponsorship, the climb to excellence in the steelpan world for village or rural groups is one fraught with disappointment and discouragement. Many of them go out of commission for lack of direction and support. He explains further that in Sangre Grande, 3 steelpan orchestras went out of commission at the time he was writing this, probably due to the lack of funding, unstable arrangements with land tenure, and or residential complaints about noise. The Toco band, which is the song I played at the beginning of the presentation, explains the struggles that steelpan players experience in underdeveloped rural areas. So here we can see how corporations' tendency to want to sponsor the most popular bands or the most competitive bands or the bands with the most titles exacerbates wealth inequalities, because if all the sponsors want to sponsor the bigger bands, then none of the sponsors will want to help the smaller bands, the bands in the rural communities or the more lesser known bands, and that eventually affects a band's ability to function because they need the support, they need the financial support. So another impact of sponsorship on pan, and one that I would say is one of the more important ones as a sociology student, is the transition from grassroots to middle class culture. And when I say middle class culture, I mean a belief or a valuing of nationalist ideologies mixed with creolized forms of cultural expression. And if you're unaware, when I say creolized, I mean those African cultural activities that have been transformed by Eurocentric values and norms. And this is something that has happened in Steelpan. So Casablanca writes that most rural bands make it quite clear that they were established for musical enjoyment. The urban bands have become quite commercialized and specialized, and as a result do not form as an integral part of the community life as do the village bands. Private sponsorship's focus on advertising and commodification has therefore been an important force behind establishing adjudicated competitions, such as Panorama. The pressures of tourism and the global commodification of culture have removed pan further away from its grassroots origins, with sponsors opting for hegemonic adjudicated competitions instead. So here we see how the promotion of stage aesthetic rather than street aesthetic puts bands at odds with their communities and grassroots beginnings. This brings up the question, which audience do these events cater to? The stage aesthetic came with assurances of reserved seating, punctuality, and consistent musical quality. This may have reflected the concerns of tourists and Trinidadians expecting to enjoy a stage spectacle from a privileged vantage point after paying good money for their seats. The industry has also adopted British colonial values, represented in the attitudes of formerly trained judges. And I think somebody who sums up this impact very well is Pat Chufoon, who said that, well, long after when they settled down properly and they were like gentlemen of Pan, and Pan started to make history in Europe, then and only then certain top companies started to assist to choose sponsorships here and there. And I think that this is important because Pan had to go through a transformation in order to be palatable to the middle and upper classes, which is who the sponsors were targeting with their advertisement and with their production of these stage shows. So in order to get their patronage, they had to make Pan more palatable and more, I would say, not necessarily Eurocentric, but have a certain standard that is tied to European values and norms. But on the other hand, sponsorship did have some positive impacts on Pan. Firstly, it brought the end of Steelpan clashes. So according to Dudley, sponsors applied pressure on the Steelpans to desist from violence. The resulting improvement in behavior helped to break down the social stigma that many in the general public had long associated with steel bands. This is also George Yeats' opinion, who was quoted saying, "From then onwards, this is where I can say that Despers has been the trendsetters for good behavior in the steel band movement, because they no longer had cause to fight. They were thinking that they would lose their sponsorship, so that sort of held them." And this point is also kind of tied to my previous point about having to change the culture to a more middle-class culture, with a more civilized, quote-unquote, type of behavior, because obviously corporations would not want to be associated with bands that were inflicting violence upon others or creating chaos in the public. So it was very important for steel bands to polish up their image in order to attract sponsorship. Another impact that sponsorship has had on Pan is that it has brought many innovations and technology into the industry. So according to Dudley, sponsorship also was a stimulus to tuning and arranging innovations that helped to consolidate the new social position of the steel band. He goes on to quote Anthony Williams, who said that sponsorship helped in the development because steel bandsmen wanted to experiment. We wanted Pans to experiment. Later on, they assisted in paying for tuners. The festivals demanded expert arrangers, and with the sponsors, they were able to pay for that service. Before that, they couldn't afford that. And there are many examples of this. One of the most recent examples that I could find was that NGC they signed a memorandum of agreement with the MIC Institute of Technology. This was done somewhere around 2022. And they did this deal with MIC for the delivery of a customized mechanical engineering technology with Steelpan manufacturing program. So in September 2022, 6 members from NGC-sponsored bands successfully completed the program. The panists remained committed to their learning and were trained in the areas of sinking and countersinking, marking, grooving, setting, backing, cutting, and tuning of the steel pan. This also contributed to the final impact I will be talking about, which is work for every steel band professional. Dudley states that because of sponsorship, steel bands have also continued to dream the impossible dream of employment for every steel bandsman. Every player who performs in Panorama receives a small sum of money for the season, and some make extra money for other kinds of work in the panyard, including painting and welding. Sponsors also sometimes send the bands to other islands or to Europe, Canada, or the United States. This increased the steel band's exposure in the global market and also provided year-round opportunities for pan players. And I think this is also a very important point, because through sponsorship, steel bands and pan players have been able to really expand. They've been able to expand in opportunities and also expand their reach on a global level. So in conclusion, we can see that sponsorship provided the legitimacy, funding, status, and organization that bands needed. Private sponsors benefited from advertisement, public relations, and prestige, while public sponsors found a vote-catching gimmick to win favor with particular communities and political groups. And I think this quote by Tony Slater perfectly sums up what sponsorship does for PAN. Tony Slater said that sponsorships play a good part in easing the tension. To me, it gives and takes. Because some people say you lost your name, but you get money. And a lot of bands need money because preparing a band for Panorama is expensive. Sponsors have done a lot. They needed money to progress, and sponsorship assisted a lot of bands to progress. Some bands don't need sponsors, they get along somehow. But the bands with sponsors, those are the progressive bands today. So I would like to thank you for tuning in to my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it.